Hello again, my name is Liam and you're on my YouTube channel. This evening I'd like to discuss political ideologies and political identity with you, because this can be an area that gets extremely convoluted and confused, especially in our modern discussions here, whether in person or on social media or whatever. People are constantly throwing around words, labels, identifications. Oh, you're a conservative, you're a liberal, you're a leftist, you're a fascist. All these terms we throw around. And many of them get really messed up along the way. Sometimes words are used in a way that actually conveys literally the opposite of their actual meaning. Sometimes they're used in a way that completely muddies the effect. Sometimes they're thrown around in such a sloppy way that they lose all meaning whatsoever. And I'd like to try to sort out some of these things for you by talking through a few basic considerations by way of defining them, trying to put them in relationship to one another. And hopefully this will help to clarify some of your discussions with people. If you run into a political debate, you're trying to explain something to someone and they challenge you on the meaning of words, maybe you can even suggest that they watch this video. We'll see. And I'm going to try a few different ways to approach this. I'm going to try and give you ways to visualize the overall models, ways to sort of like conceptualize this. I'll talk through some basic questions of definition for each of the major terms I'm going to use. And then I'll provide some practical examples for each of them to help them make a bit more sense. And I'd like to start, actually, by challenging you to imagine something a bit in three dimensions. Now, I had an ex many years ago who was convinced of the virtues of multidimensional thinking. And she did a bit to kind of like, push me in this direction here. I don't visualize things nearly as well as she does. But I got a little bit better at it, and I must say I have a certain affection for it. So I made a cube out of an old cardboard box. And I'm going to use this to sort of talk you through 6 major positions, sort of like, archetypal positions that we can kind of like set up on 3 different axes, 3 different directions, right? And then to make it a little easier, once I talk through what each of these means, I'll take this down to 2 dimensions in an additional spectrum, because I think that'll be a little easier for us to work with in the conversation. But I want to sort of put all 3 axes into their relationships with one another, so you can recognize that there are 3 different nested concerns, 3 different major issues. So first off, what are the 3 axes? Well, one is over a basic authority model. The one is basically the political realm. How should our society be structured? What should our relationships to one another be in terms of our politics? The other is economic. What should be our economic relationships to one another? What should be our economic relationship to property be? And a third is, well, perhaps it's best conceived of as an aesthetic, or a way of conceiving of the world. It basically, you can take this in a number of different directions here, whether sociological or through evolutionary psychology, and look at basic orientations that human beings might have to our relationships with one another. How we basically approach ourselves and others as social animals. So I'm going to put these 3 different areas into dialogue with one another. So let's start off with the economic. That's one that's often misunderstood here. So let's look at two different aspects of it. So let's start with capitalism. So let's start with the capitalist side. Now, this is generally put on the right, so I'll put this on your right. All right, and we'll run through to the left. So our capitalist perspective here, if we can break this into four major points. First off, capitalists support private property. Now, what is private property? Private property is not this cardboard cube. This cardboard cube is personal property at best. All right? Private property is your ownership of land and or in general the means of production, by which we mean big infrastructure things or factories, large investments, things that generate wealth and value. Anything that generates wealth and value. All right, land can generate wealth through rent. A factory generates wealth through the production of gizmos that you can sell. A bank generates wealth through its investments, etc., etc. Those are like our means of production. So capitalism is for private ownership of the means of production. Now, capitalism is also for private investment, and this is a key part of the definition that's often missed. I don't know how many people I've had tell me that they're a capitalist and they support capitalism because they're a capitalist, because they want small business owners to be able to run their own shops and sell tomatoes in the market or something. A small business owner is not necessarily a capitalist, right? By some definition, you can call them a capitalist because they may own their shop, right? Although they may be renting it, that's much more common. But capitalism is really about the investment of capital. So arguably, small business owners are not really capitalists. They're at best a kind of what you can put in sort of Marxian terms as a petty bourgeois. Like the small business owners, the people that really don't affect things in any great deal in terms of class relations. Private investment means that you, the capitalist, have capital, meaning cash, wealth, whatever, tons of value that you can then invest in something. So, person A wants to start a business. He wants to become a local grocer and sell things. Well, he doesn't have the money to do that, so he needs to get a loan to rent the store and purchase the produce, to buy his tomatoes for the display and to hire his staff to work there. So he goes to a capitalist. He isn't the capitalist. He goes to a capitalist and asks for a loan. Right? That loan is the capital investment made, and the capitalist expects a return on that investment, which takes us to our third part, private profit. Any profits generated from that investment in that business are expected to accrue back to the capitalist, not just to the business owner. Right? So the capitalist wants money back. If it's a simple loan, we can think of it in terms of usury, of lending money on interest and expecting it to be repaid with interest, right? Or it could be in the form of stock and sort of like a shared ownership of your company. It could be in any number of ways, but they expect a certain amount of profit to accrue back to them in exchange for them having ponied up cash in the first place. And finally, as a distinction here for capitalism, at least in the modern sense, not in the, say, like the early modern mercantile capitalism, but in modern capitalism, there is a principle of non-interference in markets. So our capitalists here are basically arguing for government to stay out of the economy, right? To have as little regulation as possible or no regulation. All right, expecting that the markets are the best at determining what it is people actually want. You can say, well, what about pollution? We shouldn't regulate polluters. Well, the free market will regulate polluters, because if a company is dumping sludge in the river, then no one will want to buy from that company, because the company be run by awful people, and who wants to patronize a business run by awful people? So the market will punish them. So government doesn't need to do it. That's the free market's ideology on this. That's their perspective. Cool. So there's our 4 features, all right, for capitalism. So let's flip that around, right? Always easier to define the second half of these binaries. So our socialist perspective here, so flipping it around to your left, right, socialism, our socialists are for social ownership of the means of production. Now, this can take a variety of forms. It does not necessarily mean that the state controls things. Many forms of socialism are anti-statist, and we'll get to that when I talk about some practical examples. But the question here is of whether or not individuals, right, or people working in concert, putting their own money up, should be allowed to own the means of production. All right, and the socialist argues no, that the means of production should be in social hands, in the hands of the community as a whole. All right, that they should be able to determine what is done with different things. It's sort of like, collectively, that no individual is able to profit off of it. Think about, charging rent just to live someplace, et cetera, right? Our second part in that would be social investment. Right. So instead of an individual capitalist putting up the money and expecting his return there, you would have different mechanisms for providing that kind of money in the first place. Now, that could mean in sort of more authoritarian forms of socialism. That could be the state making decisions, sort of what we call a command economy or a planned economy. Or a state having like a national bank that kind of provides cash here, or in the very common non-statist forms of socialism, it could mean that there are various ways for individuals and workers to pool their money, pool their resources in order to start a business together, right? Or to take out non-profit loans. So here we're talking about the creation of worker co-ops, where workers own things directly and pool the money to produce them in the first place, or a kind of non-profit banking system, sort of like a credit unions, where money is lended to start up businesses here, but not with the expectation of a profit, right? So there's our third one there. Instead of private profit, we're going to talk about social profit. Right, the profits are to be shared sort of collectively. This could mean in terms of society as a whole, right? That especially in the more authoritarian branches, you talk about sort of the shared resources overall, or in maybe the more mutualist approaches here to socialism, or a number of the non-authoritarian ones, you can think about individuals collectively profiting off of something. So I start a co-op with some fellow workers here. We start a business. We're going to manufacture widgets. Let's say we're going to manufacture cardboard boxes. And we're going to produce these cardboard boxes. And our business, everyone involved in it, the people who work in this business, all share in the profits of that company. All right, so they all take a share of it. It isn't one person makes all the profit and then employs people. Here is a paycheck for showing up to work, right? What socialists often call wage slavery, having to work for a wage for somebody else instead of working for yourself or owning your own labor. In a socialist model, you own your own labor because you are working by choice with other people in a cooperative fashion here, and you all therefore share in the profits of that business. Right? So that covers this aspect of it here. So, okay, our fourth one, where I said that the capitalists prefer non-interference by government in markets. They prefer the invisible hand of the market to structure things, deal with inequities and whatnot here. The socialist favors regulation. The socialist favors some kind of interference, whether that be by a regulatory state in the command economies or the hybrid economies, or by social policies or social decisions. People working together on a kind of cooperative level, direct democracies insisting that particular local co-ops stop dumping their chemical sludges into the river. So there's the responsibility by society as a whole to get involved and regulate the businesses. So, continuing with our cube, let's create an axis running in this direction up and down. So we'll contrast here our authoritarian and libertarian perspectives, right? Authoritarian then up on the top here, right? So you can be then authoritarian right or authoritarian left, right? But our authoritarian perspective is one that argues for individual leaders, right? The great leader cult, whether it be individuals here or the state as a whole. Authoritarian rule is not necessarily of a dictatorial type. It simply means that someone is in charge and someone is in control over all, someone is dictating how things work. The authoritarian prefers some sort of enforced social order, which means, as a second feature, that authoritarians prefer hierarchies. There are leaders and there are followers, right? And everyone has to know their place in that hierarchy. Think of a military chain of command, but for society. You can see this reflected in any number of ways. The United States, for example, is a representative democracy, which means that we elect a political class to be in charge and to do things, and they clearly have more power than we do. We also have a policing force, and the police have a monopoly of force. You cannot shoot your neighbor. The police can shoot your neighbor. That's sort of the decision that we've made here, to create a kind of like social hierarchy with different responsibilities and different levels of power. So power is the fundamental feature here in the authoritarian libertarian axis. Along with that, the authoritarian side of that axis favors might. You've heard the old adage, might makes right. Well, someone has power and they're able to use that power. The authoritarian tends to argue from that perspective. If you question on something, well, is it right that the policeman shot that? And the authoritarian will say, well, he's the policeman, right? He must have felt that there was a good reason to do that, and who are you to question that, right? Who are you to question, dear leader, right? That's the authoritarian perspective in a nutshell, that the exercise of power, even if it seems arbitrary, is by definition just. And finally here, we can think about the mechanisms by which authoritarian the authoritarian perspective is played out. That can be the military, for example, or it could be simply policing. Policing is an inherently authoritarian perspective. You are empowering people to enforce laws. Law is a feature of authoritarianism. All right, in a libertarian perspective, law is not necessary. So let's flip that around a bit, and let's look at our four features for the libertarian perspective. A libertarian perspective is not going to favor leaders at all. It's going to favor a kind of like an emphasis on individual freedoms and individual liberties. Right? Rather than having someone to tell me what to do, I should know what to do. I should be able to exercise my own will. I should be able to act as I choose, as long as I'm not harming other people. So the libertarian perspective inherently trusts people more. You find that the authoritarian perspective is often favored by people who have a more cynical view of human nature, that think that humans are naturally a bit more mischievous, more likely to misbehave, more likely to harm one another. And the libertarian perspective is often held more by people who are more trusting in human nature, more likely to think that, well, left to their own devices, humans really aren't that bad, right? Humans can get along in some way. So, to look at the might makes right aspect that we saw with authoritarianism, libertarians favor consensus. They favor negotiation. They favor discussions. They favor people working their differences out, rather than trusting that someone will impose order for us. We have to get involved. We have to negotiate. We have to work that out for ourselves. The libertarian perspective or the anarchist perspective is not opposed to order as much as it is opposed to enforced order or to hierarchy. People are able to organize their societies however they choose, but they have to do it directly. They have to be involved in that. There's a kind of direct democracy involved here, a kind of constant negotiation rather than being born into a particular social contract. That social contract is continually renegotiated and its details shift through your direct involvement in that. And finally, thinking of the policing model of the authoritarians, where you have a specific empowered force to do that, whether it be military or the civil policing force, and they have a monopoly of violence in society, the libertarians remove that entirely in favor of community policing. All right, just in line with the way they favor a kind of voluntary social order in the first place, right? They favor a more cooperative approach to dealing with the inevitable troublemakers, right? Some people will act out. Some people will be problematic here, but rather than relying upon the state to find them, we have to get involved and we have to address these problems ourselves, or on a regular basis, sort of like elect certain people to do it. Think about, a small town sort of electing a sheriff kind of thing, but rather than the sheriff having the law behind him, he has simply the community behind him, et cetera, et cetera. The details vary tremendously from place to place here, but the idea here is that you do not have somebody with the ability to act with any kind of actual authority or impunity, right? The authority has to come from the community overall. So that covers, our top and bottom of our perspectives here, our authoritarian and our libertarian perspectives here. So let's throw our third axis onto that. And the terms I settled on for this are a little different than we might expect, because conservative is one of them. And what do you often contrast with conservative? Well, conservative and liberal, right? Well, I'm not going to use liberal because it gets very confused. Liberalism is a particular socio-political and socioeconomic ideology, and I'll talk a bit about what that can mean. What people often mean when they say liberal, some people say liberal and they mean that particular socio-political ideology. Other people mean a particular approach to life, a particular aesthetic, right? And that, to avoid confusion, I'm not going to call liberal, although technically that is a good word for it. But because of the confusion, I'm going to call that cosmopolitan. And I settled on cosmopolitan because it presents a nice contrast with some of the features of conservatism. So let's talk through those. Here's our conservative feature here. All right, so we'll put our conservative on this side and our cosmopolitan on this side. Right, so they're on opposite sides here for our third axis. So what is the conservative in favor of? First off, key feature here. Conservatives favor tradition. Right? The way things were done before. This was good enough for my father. It was good enough for my grandfather. It's good enough for me. Why change things? You've heard the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's a conservative viewpoint right there. Conservatives argue for the retention of things, to avoid change, or for the slowing down change, managing change. If it's necessary at all, let's do it nice and slow. Let's do the change slowly and with an eye to tradition, to respect for tradition. Now, conservative here differs a bit from reactionary politics. The reactionary view is an extension of conservatism in the sense that the reactionary says, well, we don't want to preserve per se what just was or what was until quite recently. We want to push it way back. We want to go back, 50 years. We want to undo a bunch of changes here. We want to undo a lot of things that currently exist because we've gone in the wrong direction. It's an outgrowth of the conservative aesthetic, but it does take it to an extreme. All right, our second feature for the conservative orientation here And I understand that this is a loaded term. Apologies to my conservative viewers here, but the conservative viewpoint is motivated by fear. Now, I don't mean fear in the sense that there are monsters in a closet, etc., but conservatives have, they are heir to an evolved feature of the brain here that orients them toward potential dangers. Now, both of these perspectives, since I said there is a basis for them in our neurology and evolutionary psychology here, the liberal / cosmopolitan and the conservative orientations here are codependent and they co-evolve. They both serve various functions. The fearfulness of the conservative mind here makes them more conscientious, more aware of their surroundings, and more aware of potential dangers. They're on the lookout here for the stranger in the group, the wolf in sheep's clothing, if you'll pardon another expression here that I'll throw into it. It's the conservative that helps us to find those wolves in sheep's clothing here, the ones that sort of slip in and can cause problems for us. Now, this is, again, an inherently good feature here. We all need someone keeping an eye out here for dangers. We don't want to accidentally stumble off the cliff and fall. I don't know. I obviously fall on the more liberal side of this here and just think of my own lack of self-preservation. I frequently walk while I'm reading. I've got a book open in my face, and I'm not really paying attention to what I'm doing here. That's not a very conscientious attitude. Right. That, of course, it's very, very reductive, but you get the basic idea I'm trying to get at here. There are good reasons to pay close attention to the environment and its potential dangers. The downside of that is that in social terms, it can lend itself toward a fear of difference, a fear of change, a fear of the other. Right. Idea of looking out for the wolf in sheep's clothing can mean, well, people who look different from my family and are different from me are therefore different from my community and are therefore possibly a threat, right? So you see often in the conservative perspective a fear of immigration, for example. And again, excuse the use of the word fear here. I don't mean that everyone's like, oh, I'm afraid of Mexicans. No, that's not really it here, but it's the simple fact that people coming into your country from another country, speaking another language, are different from you, and you are naturally wired to be wary of difference. The conservative, for our third feature here, favors stability. Right? They don't want a great deal of change here, and that is because change too fast can upset the overall social order. It can lead to chaos, right? You've perhaps heard of the kind of the pop psychologist Jordan Peterson's recent self-help book, 12 Rules for Life, that sets itself up as its subtitle says, an antidote to chaos. The idea here is to try and restrain that chaos, to bring a certain stability or order to your own life, right? That desire for stability, for structure, is a fundamentally conservative orientation. And what it does is it actually helps to maintain overall social cohesiveness. Right? If you change too fast in society, then cultural features don't develop, they don't gel properly, it's difficult to transfer values to a new generation. There's certain value to locking in certain ideas, passing on certain values. This is something, again, that Peterson makes constant reference to, the idea that we shouldn't be questioning these laws that our ancestors came up with here. It's in the Bible, therefore it should be a good idea because somebody came up with it a long time ago, in this sense that just because it's old, therefore it is good. That obviously can be overplayed. Peterson definitely overplays this. Because nothing should be preserved simply because it's old. But the fact that it is old and is still around does impart a certain amount of stability, a certain set of core values to a society that makes it easy to reinforce those values, to communicate them to new generations. It provides a certain context for society overall. And the last feature that I can add here for the conservative side is a basic orientation to community. Now, in politics, this frequently means an orientation to nation. Or to country. So we can think patriotism toward country and or nationalism, the love for my nation as a whole. For conservatives, it's frequently more nationalism than patriotism, but again, the two can overlap and coexist, as I'd mentioned a couple of videos ago. The conservative tends to favor the interests of his nation, of his people, of his shared community or imagined community, more than the interest of anybody else. Those people in that other country, in that other nation, those other people who are different from me, to hell with them. They can deal with their own crap. So let's flip that around for our cosmopolitan perspective. And again, just for yourself, so you know that liberal is in many ways just as good a word for what I'm using cosmopolitan for here, but it's a confusing one because of what liberal actually means in political science terms. So the cosmopolitan is someone who is inherently open to change, open to difference, open to other people, to other cultures, to new ideas. The cosmopolitan does not shy away from something that's different from them, from new experiences, from changing things. They're more open to anything changing in society overall, to altering the fundamental details of the social contract if need be. And for our second feature, to contrast what's the opposite side of fear? Well, in our usage here, not bravery, because we're not talking about it in the sense of fighting or something or running from monsters, but openness, right? A willingness to embrace challenges, to accept challenges to who you are, to your ideas, to what you already know. Somebody presents a radically new perspective to you. Do you emit it out and say, no, that's not the way it was done here. That's not what I've always believed. That's not what my father taught me here. Therefore, it's wrong. That's not what the Bible says, etc. Or do you say, well, now that is an interesting idea. Now I don't believe it. It's not my idea. But let's think about it for a minute. Why might you have that idea? What are the good features about that and the bad features about it? You're willing to entertain ideas that are different from yours. You're willing to walk through these things as thought experiments to consider difference. All right? So a fundamental openness, all right, is a core feature here of the cosmopolitan perspective. Now, thinking in practical terms, to contrast that with the stability that we set up that the conservative favors, the cosmopolitan favors experimentation. They favor a constant evolution in ideas. Rather than holding to a particular idea because the Bible says it's this way, this is the way our ancestors wrote it down, this is the terms that they worked out for our social structure here, and we should stick with it because, by God, the ancestors wrote it this way for a reason, or God wrote it this way for a reason, or whatever justification you want to use for that. The cosmopolitan is going to say, well, that worked before, but maybe, just hear me out, maybe things are different now, and maybe we should be willing to consider new ideas or changes. So maybe let's tinker a bit, right? Some of the cosmopolitans will favor a more revolutionary approach. The ideas as they currently exist suck and should be thrown out completely. Others favor a more evolutionary perspective. Well, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Oh my goodness, another cliched phrase. And you want to sort of tinker with things a bit at a time, change things, move forward here. Think of the term progressive, for example. Progress, change, moving forward. That's the basic sense we're talking about here. Progressives are inherently cosmopolitan. And our last, again, our fourth feature here would be, and this has become sort of an insult on the right in the United States today here, and in Western societies overall, cosmopolitans are globalists. right? Where the conservative favors the interests of his nation or his community first, the cosmopolitan thinks of the whole. They take a more holistic view. They think more globally. They think in terms of universal values, human rights, not the rights of my people or the interests of my nation, but what would best serve everyone as a whole. Right? So championing climate change, for example, is much more common for cosmopolitans than for conservatives, because thinking of the global environment and the global climate is actually quite an abstract idea. It's humongous. I mean, how can you wrap your brain around the impact on this entire massive planet, right, with its 7+ billion people? Well, you have to, right, in order to tackle questions like that. And that is an inherently challenging thing for someone with a more conservative perspective. I'm not saying they can't do it. I'm saying it's not the first response. It's not the natural inclination, right? And it is for the people born of this much more liberal or cosmopolitan orientation. You tend to think much more in broader terms, more systemic terms, right? You think more in terms of like the global impact of things, right? The holistic impact, or in terms of broad universals. The discourse of human rights that developed in the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, is an inherently cosmopolitan perspective. It challenges people to think about, the interests, overall of other people, and to guarantee certain rights to them, just by definition. Certain things are wrong, and they're wrong because they violate these basic principles, right? All right, so those are the basic perspectives in our cube. Right. I want to reduce this quickly to 2 dimensions and give some practical examples. So to do that, I'm going to set down my little cardboard cube and pick up a clipboard. Right. Now, if you can see here on the clipboard, I've drawn 2 of the axes. Right. We've got our authoritarian to libertarian axis here, and our socialist to capitalist axis here. So here's our economic, and here is our political. Right? Remember, again, they are distinct. The political, right, is how power is managed within society. This is about power relations. And this one here is the socioeconomic, how we deal with the economic sphere, how we deal with, property and value. Right? And I've separated, because of the limitations of a 2-dimensional medium here, our cosmopolitan to conservative spectrum down here, right? And you can sort of add that 3rd axis in your head if you want, or however you want to do it this here. But I want to kind of try to plot our major political ideologies today in the world, because you actually can plot nearly all of them with a great deal of accuracy, using only those 2 dimensions here, these 2 axes, right? But the 3rd one will help us to explain a few unusual features, a few outliers, right? Some exceptions to the rule. So I'll throw those in afterwards here and show how that particular aesthetic can affect the ideologies that we placed up here. So let's take a look here. We've got our capitalist over here. So our more authoritarian capitalist model here, this would be the basic liberal statist perspective, right? So modern nation states organized with a capitalist economy, right? Ronald Reagan, right, is up here, right? Hillary Clinton is over here, right? Ted Cruz is in here. Marco Rubio and all those guys, right? They are people who are inherently statist because they're politicians in a organized, powerful state. But they are capitalists. They favor free market solutions to things, private ownership of the means of production, etc. And down here, you have what we can call our libertarian right perspective, or our libertarian capitalist perspective. And this would be Your Milton Friedmans of the world, and your Ron Pauls of the world here. Your Ayn Rands, people who want to get rid of the government. They want to get rid of the arbitrary exercise of power that a state can bring in, but they want to keep private ownership of land and the means of production overall. Right? They want to keep the capitalist part. The more you actually push into this corner, into what many people call the anarcho-capitalist view, the more fundamental contradictions begin to appear. For example, the libertarian perspective overall is opposed to arbitrary exercise of power, to hierarchies. But capitalism is hierarchical by definition, because capitalism argues that people can own land, and people can own the factories, and people can own the infrastructure. So someone will own it, which means there are winners and losers. Right? So I may have gotten rid of the state and its ability to tell me what to do, but the owners still can. Right? The ANCAPs solve this problem by introducing what they call a non-aggression principle. Well, it's not a real anarcho-capitalist society here unless someone commits to only acting in ways that don't harm other people or don't take away their free choice. Right? I'm not exploiting this person here by offering him only $2 an hour here. He still has the choice of working for me or not working for me. All right? They bring in this sort of thing here, but it doesn't change the fact that there is a hierarchical relationship here and an exercise of power, and the person offering you only $2 an hour is offering you a starvation wage and knows he's doing that, right? But, again, it gets very messy for them here. But there are plenty of slightly more sensible positions here along this area here, where what I would consider a bit more philosophically justifiable positions, at least, that do limit state power and limit the exercise of state authority here, but do favor more free market perspectives. Right? So again, our Ron Pauls and Rand Pauls and all that sort. Now, shifting over to this side here, to our socialist aspect, to our left wing. Our authoritarian socialist model would be the statist socialists. So your Soviet Unions, for example, right? That where the state controlled the means of production and owned them in your name, and exercised them in your name. Right? It prevented private ownership and profit, but the state still controlled them and profited it, and the state simply provided you a salary. All right, so you can have what we on the internet often call tankies, are authoritarian leftists up into this area here. You're people who favor Lenin's model or Stalin's model, that sort of thing. Our Soviet model, our Mao Zedong's and the Cuban Communist Party, all that sort. And down along here, as we move all along the left line here, you run into a whole lot of varying shades. So there are a lot of different socialist perspectives and socialist models, right? From ones that even favor certain amounts of property ownership. So, individual ownership of property, like your more mutualist perspective. So you're a bit more toward the center here, to your outright anarchists here who completely reject state authority and also completely reject the capitalist, ownership of property here, and argue entirely for voluntary collectives and social ownership. And all along the way here. Marx himself, and Marx is often held up as sort of your archetype in Marxism as archetypically authoritarian. And this is in large part because of the Soviet experiment and a lot of the later Marxist-Leninist derivatives and the Maoist derivatives here that followed along that. But it is worth understanding that Marx himself did not favor any of these things and did not propose these solutions here. Marx thought that workers would themselves organically revolt, reject private property and remake society here, and that the state would gradually disappear because its functions would have been subsumed by workers' co-ops and collectives and unions. They would have taken over all those jobs that the state had normally done, so the state would wither away. So Marx and Marxism are technically not authoritarian perspectives. Marx would actually be about here, right? Not fully an anarchist per se, although the precise placement or degree here is questionable here, but certainly not an authoritarian or statist. Many derivatives from Marxist philosophy are authoritarian, but that's a different question here. So here we've got then our from our anarchists to our tankies, all on the left here. Right? Now, you've got a whole lot of other spaces in between here, right? And you can lay different things out here. You can say that you are, you are center-left on the economy and libertarian. So center-left, libertarian kind of thing. You can put yourself in various positions. This, for example, would be where Jill Stein is, if you remember the 2016 campaign, right? Or Bernie Sanders, just a little bit above her there. On the libertarian side, but left of center. Right, so more in favor of regulation as opposed to opposition to regulation over here. Or you've got your center positions here. So our Barack Obama in the 2008 election would have been about here, right? He drifted a bit, but let's put him about here, right? So he would have been into the authoritarian, but not tremendously so, and on the right, but again, not tremendously so. Right, what we can call a center-right statist. Right, there's any number of positions you can fall onto here, and there's as well as some unusual philosophies here. Fascism is a common one, or Nazism. One of the derivatives of fascism. There are tons of national fascist movements in various places here. Fascism is up here. Right, it is an authoritarian philosophy that is inherently conservative in some ways, and some complications there I'll talk about when I discuss fascism itself in a later video. But along that line between the two, very solidly on the conservative side here, because it favors the interests of the community, the nation, over individual rights here, and over the interests of the world as a whole. So it's an authoritarian conservative perspective here, but it's actually economically centrist. Right? There's a long-standing argument on the internet whether or not Nazism is a left-wing philosophy or a right-wing philosophy. In truth, it's neither. It's a centrist philosophy here. Nazism is center-right. Arguably, fascism is just barely center-left, right? But they're both right along here. Where they take a sort of a balanced or hybrid view. Neither of them oppose private ownership, so they can't be socialist by definition, since they do not oppose private property. But they have certain reservations about endorsing private property as a whole. In particular, they argue that property has to serve the interests of the nation. Capital must serve the interests of the nation. So if private industry can do that, right on. If private industry will best serve Italian interests, German interests, Greek interests, whatever, and then all right. If not, then the state will step in, and the state will create a public industry that will do the job here and support the interests of the nation. Because the national interest is the more important one for them, and they take then a balanced view between them. All right. So again, neither. So if you get an argument with somebody here, is Nazism on the left or on the right? Well, neither. Burst their bubble there and say it's economically centrist. Politically, it's what we can call far right. right? But far right and far left and whatnot here are very confused terms. I actually quite dislike them. Far right in general refers to a kind of a populist, reactionary, conservative, authoritarian movement. I know it's sort of a mouthful here, talking about the interests of the people economically, but not in the sense of class consciousness or class conflict, but in the interests of the nation and serving the interests of the nation as a whole in some way. That far-right ideal here, the anti-immigrant hysteria that far-right politicians put up here, is not really right in the sense of the economy. Right? And that's where it gets confusing, because people sometimes want to restrict left and right to a purely economic sphere. The left is opposition to private property and favoring class consciousness and class struggle here, and the right is favoring private property and private ownership of things and individual choices and individual investments. And calling Nazism far right gets confused for people because, well, the Nazis had things like, state industries. They sponsored major state infrastructure investments like the first highway system, right? Or sponsoring big companies like Volkswagen, right? Volkswagen, the people's car, it was a populist project here to try and produce a low-cost automobile for the average man. And these are not far-right projects from an economic standpoint, but they are in a political terms, which is, again, why I've avoided calling either of these left and right on my graph, because, again, they get confused when you do that. So let's throw that last one on there, because it's technically possible to be either conservative or cosmopolitan anywhere on here. It is simply a fact that a majority of people who are conservative are going to fall up here in the authoritarian perspectives, right? And most of your cosmopolitans are going to fall down here, but that's not necessarily the case, right? And even more so, a lot of your conservatives are going to tend to cluster over here. Right, but again, not necessarily. Joseph Stalin, we have to put all the way over here, but Stalin is arguably a conservative. He certainly made appeals to the nation, to more traditional values. He himself has a bit more of a clerical background. He certainly has the kind of fear of difference, of slowing things down. He opposes a lot of the globalist perspective that you see much more commonly in the Marxist-Leninist model. So we would have to call somebody like Stalin, say, a conservative authoritarian leftist. Right? So again, conservatism isn't just over here. It's not just the realm of Ronald Reagan. Right? It's, again, much more of an aesthetic, a personal approach to life, a way of thinking about the world. Right? And it is entirely possible to be on the more authoritarian side. Hillary Clinton actually is a considerably authoritarian right figure. She should fall about here somewhere, right? But is actually, in many ways, quite cosmopolitan. Favors free trade, right? Lowering border restrictions, much more active engagement in the world, a much more holistic approach to things like climate change, but is still firmly capitalist and firmly authoritarian, right? But has a more global perspective, which again is more frequently found down here. So there's a lot of gray areas. So, hopefully I haven't thoroughly confused you with all of this, but I'm trying to give you a number of ways to break down some of the essential confusions in our political discourse here over who is what and what these different words mean and how all that works. And hopefully you've maybe got a three-dimensional or two-dimensional way of now conceiving of these different ideologies and their relationships to one another. I'll be able to build on this in lectures moving forward, and we'll come back to a number of these terms and we'll apply them in very specific circumstances and give more concrete examples. and different. But that's all I have for today in this very long video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, there's a little subscribe button down here. Subscribe to follow my videos here, and we'll see you again next time.